because you don't simply say that we're in a cycle of traditional American anti-intellectualism or anti-rationalism, but that we're at a very, very critical juncture. What is different this time around, and why should we be more concerned than this is, as opposed to this just being another spinning of the wheel? And what is the role of religion specifically in that?
I'm going to answer the first question first. What's different is the domination of our culture by 24/7 infotainment media, which is the triumph of the video over the print culture. What this does is it gives substance to all kinds of anti-rational thoughts, not only from fundamentalist religion, but also from wacko people like the anti-vaccination crazies as well, who won't look at the medical evidence, who they know what they know because their children developed the first symptoms of autism after a vaccination, and so they believe this.
Let's talk about junk science in a minute, but then what is the role of the image? And now I'm thinking of a few years after Hofstadter, Daniel Bell wrote about the image, as well as a number of other American intellectuals. This is obviously, I don't want to say you're mired in the 60s, but we'll come back to the 60s as well, because you also have coming online in a huge way Marshall McLuhan's emphasis on the image replacing the Gutenberg galaxy, giving way to a universe of images and words and images melded together in various ways, which he tended to see more in a utopian way. But what is it then? What is it about the image, or the shift from text, or not even text, but books, to video?
It's complicated because, first of all, we all want to make excuses for ourselves and tell ourselves that, well, it's not so bad. And I am not someone who says that all video is bad or all video games on computers are bad. But what is bad about, and in fact, as sources of news, video images have almost exclusively replaced traditional print culture in newspapers and books. And what's bad about it is the way we get information from video is, as McLuhan pointed out so long ago, it's different. We get it in short bursts. We have an impression, but it's not an impression that's there very long. Say you read in a newspaper, you read a story about the run-up to the Iraq War, which doesn't strike you quite right. Well, first of all, it's there for you to remember what was said in the first place. And secondly, you can compare it with some other reports and prints by people of different points of view and so on. I say you can. But the fact is most of us don't get our news about things like the war or anything else. We get it in short bursts on cable TV, on the flashing image on the home page, 4,000 dead, the 5th anniversary of the Iraq War. And then I saw a poll released only yesterday, as we're doing this interview, that only 28% of Americans are aware of how many American casualties there are. Now, why?
But all the polls are running anywhere between 60 to 65% of Americans against the war. I think it was a mistake.
If people don't know what the facts are, it's one of the reasons that we get mired in not having a reasonable discussion about what to do. What does being against the war mean? It means, well, we sort of don't like the idea that Americans, I don't think most Americans care about how many Iraqis are killed at all. But I think it's startling that small a percentage of Americans doesn't know exactly how many people have been killed. And I do attribute that kind of information gathering to the video culture, because what we do is we hear it in a snap on TV.
Let me just, how do you test that to know, my parents were born in the 20s, and they had the equivalent of grammar school and high school educations when graduated from high school. I wouldn't say they were more informed, and I'm not sure how to test that, but I mean, the one thing that I do know is that most Americans are against the war. Most Americans were for the war ahead of time, and something must have happened where they're gathering information to change their mind on that.
First of all, we're talking about information, but there's a difference between information and knowledge. And information is kind of useless if it's not fitted into a larger body of knowledge.
A larger body of knowledge, or a larger system.
A larger system of knowledge. Just knowing this little fact and that little fact. For instance, talking about your parents in the 1930s, as we know, most Americans were isolationists, and they didn't understand what stake America had in the future of Europe. Franklin D. Roosevelt spent a lot of time in the late 30s and even right after Pearl Harbor getting people to look at maps, getting people to think about what the world would be like if it were dominated by Nazi Germany and Japan. This was a very different process than a process by which a president goes on television and says, well, we're going to do this. Period. There was no...
Well, no, but there was a bill. I've been against the Iraq War before.
No.
John Kerry was for it and then against it. I mean, there's no question. But I mean, Bush and I agree with you that I was not satisfied with the conversation, because I think if we had a real conversation, we would have gone into certainly the second Gulf War, probably not the first, but there was a boycott, there were deliberations, there were votes on authorization of force.
The votes on authorization of force.
Well, no, but I mean,
with half of Americans not even knowing where Iraq is, just what kind of a conversation was that? The Iraq War started because Americans were angry about 9/11, and they wanted somebody to blame for it, and they wanted to strike back.
No, I agree. But then
the years of attempting that Roosevelt did, attempting to make Americans think about Europe, which they didn't want to do any more than Americans today.
A lot didn't, partly because they had left Europe a generation before, and they were like goodbye to those kinds of rivalries, right?
And also,
I mean, you could be against, particularly in the early stages, I think you could be against World War II and not simply be written off as some kind of kook.
Well,
no, I'm saying, I mean, there's no reason to. I mean, and the reason we got in the war was because Japan declared war on America, and Germany declared war on America.
Well, that's not the reason why we fought the war in Europe first, though.
No, certainly not. But that was the trigger point.
If you compare the educational efforts made to achieve some kind of a critical consensus before World War II with what led up to the Iraq War, there's no comparison.
In the first Gulf War, then, George H.W. Bush did a better job because he actually did carry on a conversation. There were sanctions that were in place for a while. He went to other world leaders and built up a coalition. Not that I'm not saying you were in favor of that war, I wasn't, but that's more of a model that you would want to see.
Well, not really, because the reason the public didn't turn against that war was just that it didn't last for very long. If that war,
so that's because clearly there was no attempt to educate people where Kosovo was or what the stakes were in the Balkans.
Right. But I think that better, we can't prove, for instance, that my grandmother, who graduated from 8th grade, was more knowledgeable than the average 8th grader today, although I think she was. But what we do know, if we look at what's happened in terms of every measure of knowledge, where you talk about simple public opinion polls about information, the reading of books, the reading of newspapers, any of those things which make up, I won't say intellectual in the terms Hofstadter was talking about, a culture, by every index, we know much less today than we did in 1980, which I think you have to, when you talk about what people know about history, geography, American history in particular, we can't say really what people knew 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, but we can say that there has been a sharp decline, particularly among the young, since 1980 in knowledge.
I mean, I'm not sure, because I have a 14-year-old son and a 6-year-old son, and one of the things, and everything is anecdotal, everything is atypical on some level, but my 8th grade son does not seem less informed than I was at the time. And when you talk about figures such as the decline in newspaper reading, it also seems unquestionable that when you factor in the internet, when you factor in other news sources, whether it's radio, which is actually doing extremely well, that there's more news out there, or there's certainly more text and there's more information from more sources available.